He slapped the paper down on the table so hard the oil lamp rattled. "She goes tomorrow," Nathaniel Mercer said. "And that's the end of it." Evelyn stood in the doorway of the kitchen, a dish rag still in her hands, and heard her own father sell her like she was a broken plow. Not with anger, not even with the decency of shame. He said it the way a man announces the weather. Flat, final, already done with the conversation before it started. Across the table sat a stranger with pale eyes and a silver watch chain, nodding slowly, like he was approving livestock. She was 19 years old. She had never been anywhere. And by morning, she would belong to a man she had never met. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't matter to the people who are supposed to love you most, stay with me. Because this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit like and drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. The Mercer house had never been a warm place, but it had a kind of order to it, the kind that comes from everyone knowing their rank and staying in it. Nathaniel Mercer sat at the top, and his word was the architecture of the whole household. His wife, Margaret, had learned years ago to agree with everything he said and pretend she'd thought of it herself. His two older daughters, Cecilia and Ruth, had inherited their mother's gift for performance. They were pretty in the way that small towns notice and remember. High cheekbones, good posture, voices that never got too loud or too quiet. Evelyn had none of that. She was the third daughter, and she had arrived in the world without ceremony and had stayed that way. She was thin. Not gracefully thin, but the kind of thin that made neighbors ask if she was eating enough, that made her dresses hang wrong and her collarbones stick out sharper than was considered attractive. She had brown eyes that were a little too direct, a habit of going still when other people talked, and no talent at all for pretending things were fine when they weren't. She wasn't stupid. She knew they found her lacking. She had figured that out before she was 10 years old, on a Sunday when her father introduced her sisters to the pastor's family and then stood there with his hand on Evelyn's shoulder and said, with genuine confusion in his voice, "And this one's Evelyn." Not "this is my daughter Evelyn," not even her name said with warmth, just "this one." She had learned to make herself small after that. Not invisible, because she was never going to be invisible. She was always underfoot, always needed for the harder work that her sisters found beneath them. But she learned to take up less space emotionally, to not ask for things, to finish her work without expecting to be thanked for it. It was a reasonable way to survive. She just hadn't understood, until that night with the oil lamp and the stranger, that surviving and being safe were two very different things. The man with the pale eyes was named Garfield Pruitt, and he was Nathaniel Mercer's creditor. Evelyn had heard the name before, spoken in hushed tones between her parents after they thought she'd gone to bed. Pruitt owned 3,000 acres somewhere east of Caldwell Creek and had a reputation for calling in debts in ways that were technically legal and practically ruinous. Her father had borrowed money 2 years back. For what? Evelyn never knew exactly, though she suspected it had something to do with a cattle venture that went wrong before it started. The debt had grown. That was the thing about debt that her father never seemed to learn. It grew while you slept, while you ate breakfast, while you sat in church and shook hands with people who didn't know your business. It grew like a weed in good soil, patient and relentless. And now Pruitt had come to collect. Evelyn hadn't been in the room when they talked. She'd been washing dishes in the kitchen, listening through the thin wall with the careful stillness she'd practiced for years. She heard her father's voice go from bold to careful to small in the space of about 20 minutes. She heard Pruitt say something about arrangements and mutual benefit. She heard her father say very quietly, "Which one?" She knew what that meant before Pruitt answered. There was a man named Silas Crow who ranched about 18 miles northwest of town. His wife had died some months back, fewer than a year, Evelyn thought, though she wasn't sure of the exact timing. He had 5 children and a ranch that people said was in bad shape. He needed a woman who could work. He wasn't offering marriage exactly, though Pruitt said the word arrangement again, which seemed to cover a lot of ground without committing to any of it. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink with soapy water going cold around her hands and understood that her father was going to say yes. She waited for something inside her to collapse, some wall to give way. She had heard that people cried in moments like this, that grief hit you like a physical thing, sudden and heavy. What she felt instead was something colder and quieter. Recognition, maybe. The confirmation of something she had suspected for a long time without letting herself think it clearly. She wasn't a daughter to him. She was an asset he hadn't found a use for yet. Now he had. The conversation with her father the next morning was brief. He came to find her in the yard where she was feeding the chickens, and he stood at the fence with his thumbs hooked in his belt and told her she was going to the Crow Ranch. He said Pruitt had arranged it. He said it would be good for everyone. He said Silas Crow was a decent man who needed help with his household. He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask how she felt about it. He didn't look at her face for more than a second or two. "You'll leave in the morning," he said. "Pack what you need." Evelyn looked at him over the feed bucket. The chickens were still moving around her feet, pecking at the scattered grain, indifferent to everything. "How much?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "How much did Pruitt reduce the debt?" "For me." The color that came into his face wasn't shame. She thought at first it might be, but it wasn't. It was irritation. The irritation of a man who hadn't expected to be asked a direct question, who found the directness itself to be a kind of accusation. "That's not your concern," he said. "It is," she said quietly. "Somewhat." He turned and walked back toward the house without answering. She found out later from her sister Ruth, who had overheard more of the conversation than she'd let on. The amount Pruitt had forgiven in exchange for Evelyn's service at the Crow Ranch was the equivalent of a small herd of cattle. 12 head, maybe 15. That was her father's math. That was what she was worth to him when he'd finally been pressed to put a number on it. Ruth told her this with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic and not quite managing it. "You could have fought it," Ruth said. "You could have told Papa no." Evelyn looked at her sister, at her pretty face and her nice dress, and the small, comfortable world she'd never had to fight to stay inside, and said nothing. Because the truth was, she could not have told her father no, and Ruth knew that. The sympathy was performance, the same as everything else. She went back to her room and sat on her bed and looked at the small collection of things she owned. A handful of dresses, all of them plain. A pair of good boots. A tin of sewing needles. Her grandmother's iron skillet, heavy and black and seasoned over decades of use, which she'd inherited not because anyone thought it was valuable, but because no one else had wanted it. She put her hand on the skillet's handle. Her grandmother had been a hard woman. Not hard in a mean way. Hard in the way of someone who had been tested enough times that softness had stopped being useful. She'd lost a husband and 2 children to fever before she was 40. She'd kept a household going anyway. She'd never once, as far as Evelyn knew, asked anyone for permission to survive. Evelyn thought about her grandmother for a long time. Then she started packing. The wagon ride to this Crow Ranch took most of a morning. Pruitt had sent one of his workers to drive her, a weathered man in his 50s named Dole, who didn't offer conversation and seemed comfortable with silence, which suited Evelyn well enough. The landscape rolled by in shades of dry yellow and pale brown, broken occasionally by a line of scrub trees following a creek bed or a windmill standing skeletal against the flat sky. Evelyn watched all of it. She had nothing else to do. She had heard things about Silas Crow in the scattered way you hear things about strangers in a small town. Bits of information that accumulate without any particular intention, the way dust settles on a shelf. He was in his mid-30s. He'd built the ranch from almost nothing in his late 20s. His wife Clara had been well-liked, apparently. The kind of woman people described as capable and kind, which Evelyn had learned usually meant she had worked hard and been gracious about it. She died in the winter. The cause, as far as Evelyn knew, was illness, though no one seemed to know exactly what kind. The children's names she had gathered in fragments. The oldest was a boy named Ethan, who was said to be proud and capable and not particularly welcoming of outsiders. There were 2 more boys after him. She thought their names were Thomas and Miles, though she wasn't certain of the order. Then 2 girls. She knew one of them was young, maybe 4 or 5, young enough that losing her mother would have left a wound she didn't have the language to name yet. She thought about that child during the ride, not as a problem to solve or a difficulty to manage, just as a person, small and hurt and probably angry in ways she couldn't articulate. Evelyn understood that kind of anger. The ranch came into view around a bend in the trail, and her first thought was that it looked exactly like she'd expected, and worse. The house was a solid structure, built with care once, but the care had been suspended somewhere. The front porch had a broken board. The fence along the near pasture was missing rails in 3 places she could see from the wagon. The barn door hung at a slight angle, which meant the hinge was failing or the frame had shifted. There were tools left in the yard, but a rusted pitchfork, a bucket on its side, that hadn't been put away. These were not the marks of a lazy man. She recognized them as something different. This was a homestead that had been running on the bare minimum for a while, maintained just enough to keep from complete collapse, by a man who was doing everything alone and had run out of energy for the extra details. Grief did that. She'd seen it before, in smaller ways. It ate the margins first. Dole pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and didn't get down. She had the distinct impression he had no interest in being here any longer than necessary. Evelyn climbed down herself, her bag over one shoulder, the iron skillet wrapped in cloth and tucked under her arm. She stood in the dirt yard and looked at the house, and the house looked back at her. Blank windows, a closed door, no sign of welcome. The door opened. Silas Crow was taller than she'd imagined, broader through the shoulders, with the hands of a man who had been working outdoors since he was a boy. He looked like someone who had once been solid and sure of himself, and had been recently knocked sideways by something large. There were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with the time of day. He looked at her the way you look at something unexpected. Not unkind, but not warm either. Assessing. Behind him, a step back and slightly to the left, stood a boy who had to be Ethan. He was maybe 16, with his father's jaw and considerably more hostility in his expression. He was looking at Evelyn with an openness about his dislike that she actually found easier to manage than the alternative. She knew where she stood with a face like that. "Miss Mercer," Silas said. His voice was flat with exhaustion. "Mr. Crow," she said. A pause. He seemed to be waiting for something. Maybe for her to appear more capable, or younger, or more of whatever he'd imagined she would be. She didn't know what Pruitt had told him about her. "You're younger than I expected," he finally said. "I'm 19, she said. "I've been running a household since I was 12. I can cook, preserve food, manage livestock, and sew well enough to make clothes that hold up. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't complain about it." She paused. "I'm also carrying my grandmother's skillet, which is the best piece of cooking equipment you've likely seen. So you can judge me by how I look, or you can let me start dinner and judge me by that instead." Silas looked at her for a moment. Behind him, Ethan's expression had gone from hostility to something more complicated. Not respect, not yet, not even close. But the straightforward dismissal had softened slightly into something more like uncertainty. "Kitchen's through there," Silas said, and stepped aside. She walked past him into the house. The inside was cleaner than she'd expected. Not truly clean, but someone had been trying. The floor was swept unevenly. The dishes were stacked, not washed. There was a smell of something cooked recently, something plain and not quite enough. 4 children stared at her from the far side of the room. The younger 2, the girls she guessed, one about 8, and one who was very small and was clutching something she couldn't make out, watched her with the specific, unblinking attention of children who have learned that strangers in the house usually mean things are about to change. Evelyn looked back at them. She didn't smile. Smiling felt like a lie she hadn't earned the right to tell yet. She set her bag on the floor, unwrapped the skillet, and walked to the kitchen. She had work to do. The first meal she cooked at the Crow Ranch was a potato soup, not because it was impressive, it wasn't, but she'd looked through the kitchen stores in about 4 minutes and understood exactly what she was working with, which was very little. There were potatoes going soft in a crate, half an onion, some salt, a heel of cured pork that had been cut down to almost nothing. There was a jar of dried beans that someone had started soaking and then forgotten about, the water gone murky and stale. She threw out the beans, started fresh water on them for tomorrow. Then she peeled the potatoes with the speed of someone who had done it 1,000 times, which she had, and got to work. The children watched her the whole time. Not all of them. Ethan had gone back outside after his father, making it clear he had no interest in standing around watching a stranger root through their kitchen. But the 4 younger ones had arranged themselves in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen with the collective stillness of animals trying to decide if something was dangerous. The oldest of the 4 was a boy she figured was about 13. Thomas, she thought, though she hadn't been formally introduced to any of them. He had a careful, watchful face and the habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was thinking. The next one down was another boy, Miles, maybe 10 or 11, who kept looking at the skillet like he was trying to figure out what it was for. Then there were the two girls. The older girl, she looked about 8, had her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that was a smaller, more fragile version of Ethan's hostility. And then the youngest one, the one who'd been clutching something earlier, was standing slightly behind her sister with her face half hidden. She was holding a woman's glove. Just the one. Dark brown leather, soft with age and handling. Evelyn noticed it and looked away. She kept peeling potatoes. "What's that smell?" Miles asked. "Onion," she said. "It'll get better in a few minutes." "Mama used to put sage in soup," the 8-year-old said. Her voice carried the deliberate tone of a challenge. Not quite rude, but testing. Measuring. "I don't see any sage," Evelyn said. "Do you know where it's kept?" A pause. The girl hadn't expected to be asked a practical question. "There was some. In a tin. I don't know where it went. We can look for it after dinner. If we find it, I'll use it tomorrow." The girl was quiet. Not won over, not close to it, but slightly redirected. Evelyn had learned a long time ago that practical problems were easier to give people than emotional ones. You couldn't argue with "where's the sage tin?" There was no blame in it, no sides to take. She kept working. The kitchen was cramped and the stove ran a little hot on the left side, which she figured out when the pork started to char faster than expected on that end of the pan. She adjusted without comment. These were the kinds of things you learned about a new kitchen, its moods, its particular stubbornness. Every stove had a personality. This one was impatient. By the time Silas came in from outside, the soup was on the table. She'd found a half loaf of bread that was 2 days old and sliced it thin so the staleness was less obvious. It wasn't a good meal. She wasn't going to pretend it was. But it was hot, and it was enough, and she'd used every scrap in that kitchen without wasting a thing. Silas sat down. The children followed, all of them, including Ethan, who came in last and sat at the far end of the table and looked at the soup like it had personally offended him. Nobody said anything for a while. Spoons moved. The bread got passed without being asked. Then Miles said, with the unfiltered honesty of a 10-year-old, "It's better than what Papa made last week." "Miles," Thomas said, low and warning. "It's true." Miles looked at Silas without apology. "It's better, Papa." Silas didn't answer right away. I was looking at his bowl. There was something moving behind his face that he'd clearly had a lot of practice at keeping still. "Eat your dinner," he said. Evelyn ate. She didn't try to fill the silence. She'd learned that silence was often a kindness when people were trying to hold themselves together. She slept that night in a small room off the back of the house that had clearly been used for storage before someone cleared it out, probably in the last few days, judging by the fresh marks in the dust on the floor where boxes had been dragged out. There was a cot, a blanket, and a nail on the wall where she could hang her bag. The single window looked out onto the side yard. She lay on the cot in the dark and looked at the ceiling and took stock. The house needed a deep clean. Not urgent, but it was the kind of dirtiness that made everything harder. The kitchen stores were dangerously low and would need to be stretched until someone made a supply run to town, which meant she needed to find out what was growing in the kitchen garden, if there was one, and what shape it was in. The children were wary, and the youngest one was frightened, and the oldest one was openly hostile, and the father was a man who had been surviving on the bare edge of his own capacity for long enough that he'd probably forgotten what normal felt like. These were problems. She was good at problems. What she was less good at, what she lay awake acknowledging in the dark because she owed herself that much honesty, was not knowing how long this was supposed to last. Pruitt's arrangement had never been defined to her directly. Days? Months? And what did Silas actually know about it? Did he know she'd been sent here in exchange for her father's debt? Did he think she'd come willingly? She didn't know. And she wasn't sure how to find out without the answer making everything worse. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes and told herself she'd figure that out later. Right now, there was morning coming, and morning meant work. And work was something she actually knew how to do. The next 2 weeks were the most physically punishing of her life, and she had not come from an easy life. She was up before anyone else every morning, building the fire, getting water, starting breakfast. The kitchen garden, which she'd found on the second day behind a broken gate, was overgrown but not dead. There were beans coming in and a struggling stand of corn and some wild onions that had crept in from the field edge that were actually better than the cultivated ones. She spent an hour every evening after the children were in bed weeding and tying back the bean plants, because if she let it go another week, it would be too far gone. She fixed the broken porch board on the fourth day, because she'd nearly gone through it carrying a bucket, and the risk was unacceptable. And when Silas found her out there with a hammer and a salvaged plank, he stopped and stood and watched her for a moment without saying anything. "I've got more of that lumber in the barn," he finally said. "This piece works fine," she said. He went back inside. It wasn't a conversation exactly, but it was a little more than they'd managed before. The children were harder. Ethan she mostly left alone. She'd identified early on that pushing him would make it worse, and that whatever he was going to decide about her, he needed to come to it himself. She did not ask for his help. She did not pretend she didn't notice when he made things harder for her. The day he moved the water bucket from where she'd left it, so she spent 20 minutes looking for it before Miles told her where it was, she noted the fact of it and went on with her day. Getting angry would have felt satisfying and accomplished nothing. Thomas was easier. He was naturally helpful and only needed permission to show it. Once she started asking him specific questions about the ranch, where things were, how things worked, what the routine had been before, he opened up steadily, the way a stuck door gives when you find the right angle. By the end of the first week, he was telling her things she hadn't asked, small pieces of knowledge about the land and the livestock that were actually useful. Miles was easy because Miles was 10 and interested in food and had no particular agenda beyond filling his stomach and avoiding work he found boring. He was loud and honest and occasionally exhausting, and she found herself almost liking him immediately, which she didn't entirely trust. She had learned to be suspicious of quick affections. The older girl was named June. She was 8 and carried herself with the rigid dignity of someone in tremendous pain who had decided that the pain was a private matter. She didn't refuse to help when Evelyn asked her to. She didn't volunteer. She watched everything with dark, attentive eyes and delivered her opinions in short, flat sentences that left no room for argument. On the 5th day, June told her she was washing the dishes wrong. Evelyn looked at her. "Show me," she said. June showed her. The method was different from Evelyn's. Not better or worse, just different. The specific way her mother had done it, the way she'd been taught. Evelyn adopted it without comment. It was a small thing. She suspected it was not a small thing to June. And then there was the youngest one, Nora. 4 years old or close to it. She wasn't entirely sure, and asking Silas about her age felt like it might cost something she hadn't earned the right to spend. Nora didn't speak to her for the first 10 days. She moved around the house like a small shadow, always with that glove, watching Evelyn from doorways and around the edges of furniture. She didn't seem afraid exactly, more like she was conducting a very serious and private evaluation, the kind that couldn't be hurried. On the 11th day, Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table in the early afternoon, trying to mend a tear in the knee of Thomas's work pants, and she heard the soft sound of small feet and looked up to find Nora standing about 2 feet away, holding the glove to her chest and looking at the needle and thread with concentrated interest. Evelyn didn't say anything. She kept sewing. After a minute, Nora climbed onto the bench across the table and sat there watching her, still not talking, still holding the glove. Evelyn glanced up briefly. "You can watch," she said. "Just don't touch the needle." Nora nodded with great solemnity. She watched Evelyn sew for the better part of an hour without a single word. Then she slid off the bench and went away again. It was the closest thing to acceptance Evelyn had received from any of them. She told herself it wasn't enough to mean anything. She told herself that, and didn't quite believe it. The trouble with Ethan came to a head on a Thursday, which she knew because Thursday was the day she baked bread. And the house smelled like something good for once. And later she would always associate that smell with the worst fight of those early weeks. She'd gone to the barn to get eggs. The hens were laying inconsistently, but there was usually something if you checked carefully. She was coming back across the yard when she heard Ethan's voice, low and deliberate, talking to someone she couldn't see around the corner of the barn. She almost walked on. Then she heard her own name. "Told you she's not here to help. She's here because some deal got made that nobody explained to us. She's going to do what suits her until she decides to leave." A pause. Thomas's voice, quieter. "She fixed the porch." The porch. Ethan's contempt was specific, precise. She fixed one board on the porch, Thomas. That doesn't mean anything. Women like that. They come in, they rearrange things so they feel important, and then when it gets hard, they go right back where they came from. You think she chose to be here? You think she wants to be here? Another pause. Thomas said something Evelyn couldn't make out. I don't care how she cooks, Ethan said, louder now, heat coming into it. Mama was the one who belonged here. She built this ranch with Papa. She knew every inch of this land. You don't replace that with some girl Pruitt's people dragged out here. Evelyn stood still on the other side of the barn wall. She stood there for a few seconds. Then she walked around the corner. Ethan turned fast, and for a moment the hostility flickered into something else. Not quite guilt, but the particular discomfort of someone who's been overheard saying a true thing in a way they're not entirely proud of. Thomas went red immediately and looked at the ground. She looked at Ethan. You're right, she said. He hadn't expected that. What? You're right that I didn't choose to be here, and you're right that nobody explained it to you, and that's not fair. She kept her voice level, not because she was calm, she wasn't calm, but because she'd made a decision on her walk across the yard that she wasn't going to give him a fight. Not this one. I'm not trying to replace your mother. I don't know how I could, and I'm not going to try. Ethan looked at her. His jaw was tight. But I am here, she continued, and while I'm here, I'm going to work. You can make that harder, or you cannot. That's up to you. She looked at him for one more second. The eggs are getting cold, she said, and walked past him toward the house. Her hands were shaking by the time she got to the kitchen. She set the eggs down carefully so she didn't drop any. She hadn't been lying. What she'd said to Ethan was true. She hadn't chosen this, and he hadn't done anything wrong by naming it. But what she hadn't said, what she hadn't figured out yet how to say to anyone, was that she was starting to feel something for this broken, difficult, half-ruined place that she couldn't quite name. Something that made the work feel different from the work she'd done her whole life for her father. At her father's house, the work she did kept the household running and got her nothing. Here, the work she did was keeping something alive, something that had been close to dying. And there was a difference in that, a weight to it, a meaning that she hadn't expected to feel. She was careful not to trust it. Not yet. Not nearly yet. Silas was not an easy man to know. He was not unkind. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. He didn't speak to her with cruelty. He didn't dismiss her work. And when she made a request about supplies or repairs, he either helped or explained plainly why it would have to wait. He was functional in all the ways a person needed to be to run a household alongside someone. But he was also somewhere else, most of the time. Behind his eyes, in some part of himself that he'd walled off from the daily running of things, there was a man in the middle of something she couldn't see and hadn't been invited to witness. He talked about the ranch. He talked about the cattle and the fences and the dry stretch of land in the northeast corner that needed attention before the season turned. He did not talk about Clara. He did not talk about what the last year had been like. He did not look at the chair at the end of the table that nobody sat in. She noticed the chair. She noticed him not looking at it. She didn't say anything about either. About 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, they had their first real conversation. Real in the sense that it went somewhere, that it wasn't just logistics. It was late, after the children were in bed, after she'd finished her mending, and she'd come out to the front porch because the kitchen was too warm and she needed air. Silas was already there, sitting on the step, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the way men did when they didn't know where to put something they were carrying. She almost went back inside. Instead, she sat down on the other end of the step, far enough away to make it clear she wasn't intruding, and looked out at the dark yard. They sat there for a while without talking. It wasn't uncomfortable. Silence between them had gotten less sharp in the last few weeks. Not comfortable exactly, but functional. Like a tool they'd both gotten more practiced at using. Finally he said, "Ethan told me what you said, in the yard." She waited. "He said you didn't fight him." "There was nothing worth fighting about," she said. "He wasn't wrong." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You didn't want to come here." She turned her head slightly to look at him. He was looking out at the yard, not at her. "No," she said, "not at first. Pruitt told me you'd agreed to it." She absorbed that. She kept her voice steady. "Pruitt told you what suited him." A long pause. She could see Silas processing that, deciding what to do with it. "I didn't know," he finally said. "About your father." "I believe you," she said. And she did. She'd figured out enough about him by now to know he wasn't the kind of man who would have agreed to something he understood was coerced. That didn't fix anything, but it was something. "I can send word to Pruitt," he said. "Tell him the arrangement's done." She looked at the yard and thought about her father's house, her sister's careful disinterest, the specific quality of being in a place where your presence was tolerated without being wanted. "No," she said. He looked at her then. "No?" "I'll stay," she said. "As long as you'll have me working. I'm not doing it for Pruitt, and I'm not doing it because of my father. I'm doing it because the work needs doing and I'm capable of it." She paused. "But I want it to be a choice. Mine, not a debt." Silas was quiet for a long time. The night sounds settled around them. Crickets, something moving in the far pasture, the creak of the barn. "All right," he said finally. It wasn't gratitude and it wasn't warmth. It was simpler than that. It was an acknowledgement, plain and direct, that she had said a thing and he had heard it. She went back inside shortly after. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and thought, "All right, 2 words. The most honest thing anyone in this place had said to her directly." She fell asleep with her hand resting on the iron skillet at the side of the cot. She didn't know why she'd started keeping it there. Old habit, maybe. Her grandmother's habit, probably. The idea that you kept the things that mattered close enough to reach without thinking. The 4th week started with 2 things going wrong at once, which was how the ranch seemed to operate. Not one problem at a time, but a cluster of them, overlapping and competing for urgency. The first was the northeast fence. Silas had been watching it for days, and something had finally given way during the night, and by morning there were cattle in the wrong field, and 2 of them were missing entirely, which meant they'd gotten through to the open scrubland beyond. Silas and Ethan left at first light to find them, which left Evelyn alone with 3 children and all the morning work and a kitchen that needed restocking. The second thing was Nora. Nora woke up sick. Not dangerously sick, just the ordinary misery of a child with a fever and a stomach that had decided to revolt. But she was 4 years old and she wanted her mother, and there was nothing to be done about that except sit with her and let her be miserable. June and Thomas had gone to do the morning chores by the time Evelyn got to Nora's room, which meant nobody had told her what to do about this. She pushed the door open quietly and found Nora curled on her side in the bed, still holding the glove, her face flushed and her eyes red-rimmed from crying she'd apparently already done. Evelyn brought in a cloth dampened with cool water from the bucket. She wrung it out, sat on the edge of the bed, and laid it on Nora's forehead. Nora flinched at the coolness. Then she went still. "Is it too cold?" Evelyn asked. Nora thought about it, shook her head. "Your stomach hurting?" A small nod. "All right. I'm going to make you something easy to eat a little later. You don't have to do anything except lie there." Nora looked up at her. Her eyes were the same color as Silas's. That particular shade between brown and green that changed depending on the light. She was quiet for a moment, studying Evelyn's face with the thoroughness she applied to everything. Then she said very quietly, "You smell like bread." It was Thursday. Evelyn had been baking before she'd found Nora sick. "I do," she confirmed. Nora seemed to accept this. She closed her eyes and held the glove against her chest, and after a while her breathing evened out into the shallow rhythm of a child who's drifted off despite themselves. Evelyn sat on the edge of that bed for longer than was strictly necessary. She didn't let herself think too clearly about why. Silas and Ethan came back with both missing cattle in the early afternoon. Evelyn had food on the table by the time they got in. Something simple, the beans she'd been working on since the morning, stretched with the last of the cornmeal into a kind of thick stew that was better than it had any right to be. Ethan sat down without looking at her. He ate without comment, which was, from him, approximately the equivalent of a compliment. Silas looked tired in the specific way of a man who'd spent hours in the sun doing physical work after too little sleep. He ate steadily, and then pushed the bowl away and rubbed his face. "June told me about Nora," he said. "She's sleeping. The fever broke around noon. She kept some water down this afternoon." He nodded. "Did she—" He stopped. Tried again. "Was she upset?" "For a little while," Evelyn said carefully. "She's settled." He nodded again, the kind of nod that wasn't really about agreement, but about getting through the moment without coming apart. Thomas said, with careful casualness, "She let her put a wet cloth on her head." Silas looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at his stew. The information hung there for a moment, carrying more weight than it probably should have. "I used to hate that when I was little," Miles said cheerfully. "Wet cloths. I always thought they smelled weird." "Miles," Thomas said. "What?" "They do smell weird. Wet cloth smells like a wet dog." "Nobody asked you," Ethan said, but there wasn't quite the usual edge to it. Something shifted in the room. Barely anything. A slight loosening, a degree less tension than there had been before. Miles, oblivious and satisfied, went back to his stew. June allowed herself a small, private expression that Evelyn caught for only a second before it was gone. It wasn't a good evening. It wasn't a warm or easy or resolved evening, but it was a different one from the ones before it. And Evelyn noticed the difference the way she'd learned to notice everything in this place. Carefully, quietly, without letting on how much she was paying attention. She found the loose board by accident. It was a Saturday, 5 weeks in, and she'd gotten it into her head to do something about the condition of the main room floor. Not the whole floor, but a section near the east wall that felt unsteady underfoot and caught the broom bristles wrong every time she swept. She'd been stepping around it for weeks and finally ran out of patience with herself. She pulled back the edge of the rag rug that covered that corner, and the first thing she saw was that one of the floorboards was newer than the others. Not dramatically. It had been there long enough to match in color, mostly, but the grain pattern was different and the fit was slightly off, tighter than the settling of an older board would account for. Someone had replaced this board after the floor was laid. She pressed on it. It gave slightly in a way the others didn't. She told herself it was probably nothing. A repair. A weak board replaced at some point by someone who'd worked quickly. She told herself that, and then she got a thin knife from the kitchen and worked the edge of it into the join. The board came up easier than it should have. Underneath, in the darkness between the floor joists, was a small tin box, the kind used for keeping documents dry. It had been pushed back so it was almost invisible from above. You'd have to know exactly where to look, or be pulling up the board, to find it. Evelyn crouched over the hole in the floor for a long moment. The house was quiet around her. She could hear Miles somewhere outside, and the sound of Silas in the barn. She reached in and took out the box. It was heavier than she'd expected, which meant it was full. The latch was stiff but not locked. She worked it open. Inside were papers, letters, folded and some of them refolded multiple times, the creases soft from handling. A small ledger, the kind you'd use for keeping accounts, filled with tight handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. A folded map of what looked like the land around the ranch, with markings in pencil she couldn't make sense of right away. She sat back on her heels. The handwriting on the top letter, the one facing her, was precise and controlled. Not a man's writing. She'd learned to tell the difference growing up, from the correspondence that passed through her father's house. This was a woman's hand, someone who'd been taught to write young and had kept at it. Someone who had pressed hard on the pen because she was writing something she needed to get exactly right. She turned the letter over, and on the back, in the same tight hand, was a name. Clara Crow. Evelyn stayed very still. She looked at the letters, the ledger, the map. She looked at the hole in the floor, the way the box had been placed. Far back, deliberately, not tucked away casually, but hidden. Hidden by someone who had reason to hide something, who had been careful about it, who had put this in a place that was not meant to be found easily. Clara had been dead for less than a year. These papers had been here the whole time, under the floor of the house her husband and children were living in. She thought about what Thomas had told her, week 1, when she'd been asking practical questions about the ranch's history, and he'd answered with the candor of someone who didn't quite realize what he was giving away. He'd mentioned that his mother had gotten sick fast, that she'd been fine and then not fine, in a space of time that had confused everyone. She looked at the ledger in her hand. She turned to the first page. At the top, in Clara's handwriting, were 4 words, what they did here. Evelyn's hands had gone still. Her breathing was steady, but she could feel her pulse in her throat. She did not read further, not yet. She put the papers back in the tin box carefully, in the order she'd found them, and fitted the lid closed and set it beside her on the floor. She replaced the board, tamped it down with the heel of her hand, pulled the rug back over the corner. She sat with the box in her lap for a long time. Silas was in the barn. The children were doing afternoon chores. The house was quiet. She thought about what her grandmother used to say. On the rare occasion she talked about the things she'd survived. Some things you pick up and you can't set down again. Be sure you want to know before you look. She looked down at the box. She'd already looked. She read the first letter that night, after the house had gone quiet, and she was certain everyone was asleep. She lit the small lamp on the table in her room and sat cross-legged on the cot with the tin box open beside her and the first letter unfolded in her hands. The paper was good quality, better than what most ranch families would use for ordinary correspondence. Clara Crow had been deliberate about this. She'd known these words needed to last. The letter was dated 8 months before Clara died. It was addressed to no one, which told Evelyn something immediately. This wasn't meant to be sent. It was a record. Clara had been writing things down so they wouldn't be lost. I have been watching the Alderman Creek water for 3 weeks now, it began. The cattle on the Hensley property started dying in June. Silas thinks it's the summer heat, and maybe it partly is, but I've been downstream from that creek my whole life, and I know what sick water looks like. There is something wrong with it above the fork. I rode out to the fork on Thursday and found exactly what I expected to find and what I hoped I would not. Evelyn read slower. There are pipes. Or what remains of them, iron, poorly buried, running from somewhere in the northeast toward the fork. Someone has been redirecting something into the watershed. I don't know yet what. But I took a sample of the water at the fork in a jar, and I took a sample from our well, and I'm going to get them to a man in Caldwell Creek who will know what to tell me. His name is Josiah Ferris. He's a chemist of some kind. He worked for a mining operation before he retired out here. He will know. There was a gap, then a new paragraph in slightly different ink, written at a different time. Ferris confirmed it. What is in the water at the fork is a compound used in industrial mining operations to leach minerals from rock. It accumulates. It kills cattle slowly, which is why it looks like illness and drought. It kills people slowly too, he said, though he was careful about how he phrased that. He said children are more vulnerable. He said if someone had been drinking from a contaminated source for months. The sentence ended there. Just stopped. Clara had not finished it. Evelyn sat with that unfinished sentence for a long time. She thought about Nora's size. She thought about how small Nora was for her age, which she'd noticed but not thought through. She thought about June's pallor, which she'd attributed to grief. She thought about the way Silas had said, the night on the porch, that Clara had gotten sick fast, and Thomas saying it had confused everyone. She opened the ledger. The first pages were property records, not the official kind. Clara had been copying information by hand from sources Evelyn couldn't immediately identify. There were land parcel numbers, boundary descriptions, transfer dates, a long list of names she didn't recognize yet, with dates next to them and amounts. Some of the amounts were in cattle. Some were in acreage transferred. Some were just a dash, which Clara had used for entries she hadn't been able to verify. At the top of one page, underlined twice, Victor Blackwood. Below it, in a tight column, 17 land parcels transferred to Blackwood Holdings over 14 months. Families named. The Hensleys, the Farlows, the Grange brothers' property, the Addison widow. Some had sold, some had abandoned. One, a name circled in ink, had died, and the death had been recorded in the county ledger as Fever. She turned to the map. It was a hand-drawn copy of the land around Caldwell Creek and the surrounding properties, showing the water table and the creek forks. Someone had drawn in red pencil, the path of the contamination, where it entered the watershed, which properties it would affect downstream, in what order, over what timeline. The ranch names were written along the affected stretch. The Crow Ranch was fourth from the top. At the bottom of the map, Clara had written a single line. He needs all of it, starting with the water, then the land. Evelyn folded everything back into the box with careful hands. She sat in the small yellow lamplight and thought. Victor Blackwood, she knew that name. Not well. He was not someone who had crossed her path directly, but she'd heard it the way you heard the names of powerful men in small towns, spoken with a particular quality, a slight adjustment in the speaker's posture, the careful avoidance of anything that sounded like criticism. He had money, and he had reach, and he had the county land office on his side in a way that made people careful around him. Clara had been gathering evidence against him. Clara had found out about the water. And Clara, who had been careful and methodical and who had pressed hard on her pen because she needed to get things right, had died of an illness that moved too fast for anyone to understand. Evelyn put the box back in the space under her cot, tucked against the wall. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark and thought about her grandmother's words again. Some things you pick up and you can't set down again. She had picked this up. She spent the next 3 days deciding how to tell Silas. This was not indecision. She'd made up her mind quickly that he needed to know, that there was no version of this that didn't require him to know. What she was figuring out was the how, because what she was about to put in front of him was not just information. It was the possibility that his wife's death had not been what everyone believed. That was not something you dropped on a man without thought, without care about what the weight of it might do when it landed. She watched him during those 3 days the way she'd learned to watch people in this household, without being obvious about it, the way you keep a piece of damaged fence in your peripheral vision while you're doing other work, gauging whether it's going to give. He was better than he'd been 6 weeks ago. That was real. He laughed twice in 3 days. Once at something Miles said at dinner, and once at something Thomas did with a rope in the yard, a quick surprised laugh that seemed to catch him off guard. He still didn't look at Clara's chair, but he'd started to talk more at meals, started to ask the children small questions about their days, started to come back into the edges of his own life, in the tentative way of someone testing whether the ice will hold. She didn't want to put what she knew through the floor he was trying to rebuild, but she didn't have a choice. Clara had hidden those papers for a reason. If Blackwood's operation was ongoing, and the timeline in the ledger suggested it was, the Crow Ranch was still in his path. The contaminated water was still there. The children were still drinking from the well. That last thought settled the question cleanly. On a Tuesday evening, she asked Silas if she could speak with him privately. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him tell the children to go finish their chores without argument. She brought the box to the kitchen table. She laid out what she'd found and what she'd read, in order, without editorializing. The location of the box, the date of the first letter, what Clara had found at Alderman Creek, what Ferris had told her about the compound, the ledger records, the map. Silas sat across from her and did not say a word through any of it. She watched him the way she'd been watching him for days, steadily, with the attention you gave to something that might break. His face moved through things she couldn't name. His hands, flat on the table on either side of the box, went from relaxed to rigid somewhere around the time she started talking about Ferris's confirmation. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "How long have you had this?" he said. His voice was even. That evenness was costing him something. 3 days. "Why didn't you—" He stopped, tried again. "Why did you wait?" She met his eyes. "Because I needed to figure out how to tell you without it killing you." He looked away. The muscle along his jaw worked. "The well," he finally said. "I think you should have it tested. I think the contamination may not have reached it yet. The map shows the Crow well as a separate source from the creek feed, but I'm not certain. I can't be certain from what Clara wrote." He got up from the table. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the yard. She could see the set of his shoulders, the specific tension of a man carrying something that has just gotten significantly heavier. "She was sick for 2 months," he said. Not to Evelyn, exactly. To the window, to the yard, to whatever version of the last year he'd been living with. "I thought it was her lungs. Dr. Henning said it was her lungs." "It may have been," Evelyn said carefully. "I don't know what the compound does to a person. I only know what Ferris told Clara, which was that it accumulates." "She went to the fork," Silas said. "She brought water samples back. She had jars in the cellar she wouldn't explain to me." He turned from the window. His face was changed, not broken. Something under it had shifted, some framework. "I thought she was losing her mind. Toward the end, when she kept talking about the water, I thought it was the fever." Evelyn didn't say anything. "She was right," he said, "and I thought she was out of her mind." "You didn't know," she said. "No." He pulled out the chair and sat down again, heavily. He looked at the tin box. "She hid it. She was trying to protect the evidence. She must have known she was running out of time. And Blackwood," his voice changed on the name, went lower and harder, the way a boot heel comes down on solid ground. "Blackwood is behind it." That's what the ledger shows. The land transfers, the timeline, the properties affected. Your ranch is on the list. He was quiet again. The lamp between them threw unsteady light across the table, and she could see him thinking, not frantically, but with the methodical focus of a man who had built things, who understood that you solved problems by breaking them into their parts. I need to ride to Caldwell Creek, he said, to find Ferris. If he's still there, if he'll talk. Clara trusted him enough to go to him. She went alone. She didn't tell me. He said this without accusation, but she could hear what was underneath it. The particular grief of being loved carefully by someone who hadn't wanted to frighten you, and the way that carefulness became its own kind of distance. She was protecting you, Evelyn said. I know. He pushed back from the table. I know she was. He went to bed that night without saying much else. She heard him through the thin wall of the house, awake long after the children had settled, the creak of the floorboard, the sound of someone unable to hold still in the dark. She lay on her cot with her hand on the iron skillet and listened to the house breathe around her, and thought about all the ways that knowing the truth didn't actually fix anything. It just changed the shape of what you were carrying. Silas rode to Caldwell Creek on Thursday. He told the children he had business in town, which wasn't a lie exactly. He told Evelyn that Ethan was in charge until he got back and she should not hesitate to override him if necessary. He won't listen to me, she said. He will, Silas said. He's starting to. She wasn't sure she agreed with that assessment, but she let it go. He was gone 2 days. Ethan managed the ranch with the competence she'd expected of him, because whatever else Ethan was, he was not a boy who shirked work. He didn't make trouble while his father was away. He gave Evelyn the uncomfortable courtesy of someone who has made a private decision to tolerate a person they haven't fully accepted. She got a great deal done in those 2 days. She finally attacked the state of the cellar, which she'd been putting off because the scale of it was daunting. Preserves that needed cataloging, tools that needed to be cleaned and properly stored, a section in the back corner that smelled damp in a way that suggested something was rotting that shouldn't be. Thomas helped her for most of it, quietly and efficiently, handing things up the stairs when she needed. She also, while the children were occupied with afternoon chores, went back to the well. She'd been thinking about it since the night she'd laid out the evidence for Silas. Clara's map showed the Crow well as drawing from a separate source, not from the Alderman Creek watershed. But separately sourced didn't mean safe, not if the contamination had been spreading long enough. She didn't know what contaminated well water looked like or smelled like, and she had no way to test it herself. What she did was look at the ground around the well casing. The earth was dry but stable, no unusual discoloration, no dead vegetation in a concentrated pattern. The wood of the casing itself was in reasonable shape. She pulled up a bucket and looked at the water in the afternoon light. It ran clear. No visible sediment, no oily sheen, no smell she could identify. She didn't know if any of that meant anything, but she switched the household to boiled water without explaining the full reason. She told the children it was a hygiene practice she'd always followed, which was partially true, and that boiling cost nothing but time. Ethan looked at her sideways when she said this. He knew she was managing something. He didn't press her, which was probably the most mature thing he'd done since she'd arrived. Silas came back on Saturday, late afternoon, and his face told her before he opened his mouth. Ferris was alive. He was old now, and his eyesight was bad, but his mind was intact. He remembered Clara. He remembered the water samples. He had kept his own records, a cautious man, apparently, the kind who understood that knowing something dangerous meant you needed documentation of what you knew and when you knew it. His records corroborated everything in Clara's ledger. "He'll talk," Silas said. They were standing in the yard, just the two of them, the children inside. "Not to the county sheriff. He says Blackwood owns the sheriff's office. But to a federal land commissioner. There's one in San Antonio." "That's a long way." 2 days' ride. 3 if the roads are bad. He looked at her. "I need to get Clara's records to the commissioner's office before Blackwood finds out we have them." She'd been thinking about this since Tuesday. "You need copies," she said, "before you take the originals anywhere. If something happens to those papers on the road, the originals are gone." Silas nodded slowly. I can copy the ledger by hand. It'll take a few days, the letters too." "The map." "I can trace it." She'd done precision work with needles her whole life. A pencil was not beyond her. He looked at her with the particular expression she'd started to recognize, the one where he was recalculating something about her. Not surprised exactly, because he'd stopped being surprised by her competence a few weeks back, but recalibrating the scope of it. "All right," he said. She spent the next 4 evenings copying the documents by lamplight, her handwriting small and close so she could fit everything onto the paper she had. The ledger was the most demanding. She copied every entry, every property transfer, every date. Her hand cramped on the third night, and she had to stop and press it flat against the table and wait for the muscle to release before she could continue. She made herself precise. She made herself slow. Clara had pressed hard on her pen because she'd needed to get things right, and Evelyn could do that much for her. She did not know they'd been found out until the smell of smoke woke her. It was a Wednesday, 11 days after Silas had returned from Caldwell Creek, and 6 days before he was planning to leave for San Antonio with the originals. The copies were finished and hidden. She'd wrapped them in oilcloth and put them in a different location from the tin box, in the cellar behind the preserves jars. 2 separate caches. She'd been thinking like Clara. She didn't know what time it was when she woke. Late, very late, the kind of dark that meant the small hours. She was up and moving before she was fully conscious, because smoke in a house meant one thing and everything else waited. She got the door to the hall open and the smoke was thicker there, coming from the direction of the barn. She could see the orange light through the window at the end of the hall. The barn was on fire. She didn't scream. She was already running. She hammered on Silas's door as she passed. "Fire the barn! Get up!" She didn't wait to hear him answer. She went for the children's rooms, hitting each door, her voice hard and clear, and carrying no panic even though something under her ribs had gone cold and tight. "Get up! Fire! Get out of the house! Now!" Miles came out of his room and immediately started crying, which was understandable. She gripped his shoulder. "Outside, straight to the far side of the yard. Don't stop." Thomas came next, and she didn't need to tell Thomas twice. He was already moving toward the younger girl's room, the practical family instinct of an oldest sibling cutting through the shock. She heard Nora cry out, heard June's voice, sharp and steadying in a way that was suddenly the voice of someone much older than 8. She went back to the main hall. Silas was coming out of his room, and behind him, she saw it in the same instant he did, there was movement through the front window that was not the movement of fire. There were men outside. 2 she could see from here, maybe more. They weren't trying to help. Silas looked at her. "The children," she said. "Get them to the creek bed," he said. "There's a cut in the bank, south side, deep enough to—" A sound like something hard against the front door. Not knocking. Silas picked up the rifle that had been leaning against the wall near his door. She hadn't noticed it there before, hadn't known he'd put it there, and the fact that he had meant he'd been expecting something, or feared it. The thought moved through her fast, and she didn't stop to examine it. She went back down the hall. Thomas had the girls. June had Nora by the hand, and Nora had her glove, because of course she did. She would have it in a burning world. Miles had stopped crying and gone to something tighter, more frightened, hands fisted at his sides. "We're going out the back," Evelyn said. "Stay low. Stay with me. Don't run until we're clear of the yard." "Who are they?" Thomas asked. His voice was steady enough. He was 13 and scared and holding himself together with both hands. "I don't know," she said, which was not entirely true, but the truth was too large to say quickly, and there was no time. She took Nora from June. The child locked her arms around Evelyn's neck and didn't make a sound. That small, fierce grip was something. She felt it in her chest, added it to the list of things she would not let herself look at directly right now. She got the back door open. The night air came in carrying smoke and the smell of burning wood and something else, something acrid that wasn't quite right, not the smell of an accidental fire. She noted this and kept moving. They went across the backyard in a low, fast line. She had Nora on her hip and June's wrist in her free hand, and Thomas was behind her with Miles. She went for the south side of the creek bed the way Silas had described it, following the sound of the water, which she'd always kept track of because water was always relevant. The cut in the bank was real, a deep notch where the earth had eroded under the root system of an old cottonwood. There was enough room for all of them if they pressed in. She got the children into it and turned. "Don't move from here," she said. She looked at Thomas. He looked back at her. "You're in charge." "Where are you going?" he asked. She was already moving. "Why?" She went back around the south side of the barn, away from where the fire was loudest. The barn was burning fast, too fast, the way things burn when they've been helped. And the orange light threw long shadows across the yard that she used the way she'd used silence her whole life, as cover. She came around the corner and saw two of them, ranch hands by their clothing, or dressed like it. One of them holding a lamp he'd been using to spread the fire, the other one with a rifle who was watching the front of the house. Neither of them was looking south. She didn't have a weapon. She had gotten out of her room with her boots and her dress and nothing else. She looked around her in the shadow of the barn wall and found what the fire and the panic had left available to her. A piece of split fence rail, 4 feet long, that had been leaning against the barn for 2 weeks because she'd told Silas to repair that section and he hadn't gotten to it yet. She picked it up. She thought about what she'd figured out in the last weeks about the ranch, about the land, about the way the yard was laid out and where a person stood to have the best angle on the house. She thought about the fact that a man watching a doorway is not watching what's behind him. She moved toward the one with the rifle. She was not thinking clearly, exactly. She wasn't feeling particularly brave either. There was fear somewhere, but it was underneath the function, underneath the one step at a time of deciding that Silas was outnumbered in that house, and that was a problem she could affect. That she had children pressed into a creek bank counting on her to make the right choices, which meant she needed to change the balance of what was happening in this yard right now. She got close enough. She swung the fence rail. It connected with his shoulder and the side of his head, not a clean hit, but hard enough. He went sideways, the rifle went down, and he was on the ground making noise before she had time to think about the fact that she'd just knocked a man down. The second one turned. She had a half second before he processed what he was seeing. "Hey!" She swung again. This one she aimed better. His arm, not his head. She wasn't trying to kill anyone. She was trying to slow them down. And he dropped the lamp and it went out when it hit the dirt, which was the best thing that had happened in the last 20 minutes. She heard the sound of the front door and Silas's voice, commanding, carrying, and then another voice she didn't know, arguing, and then the crack of a rifle shot that made every nerve in her body fire at once. She did not run. She picked up the fallen rifle from the man on the ground and held it, because having it mattered, even if she never used it, even if the weight of it in her hands was the whole of its usefulness. The shot had come from outside, not from inside. She heard Silas call out again. His voice was still there. It was still standing, and she let out one breath she'd been holding without knowing it. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not clean or well organized. There were 3 men in total. She'd dealt with 2, and Silas had the third at the front of the house. A standoff that ended not in another shot, but in the third man deciding that the odds had shifted and making the choice to run. She heard hoofbeats going fast toward the north road. The barn burned for another 2 hours. Silas had gotten the horses out. That was where he'd been when she'd gone to the children, she realized. He'd gone straight to the horses because livestock couldn't save themselves. They lost the barn's southwest section, and all the feed stored there, and a collection of tools she'd have to inventory in daylight to account for. They did not lose the house. They did not lose the cattle. They did not lose the children. And the tin box, and the oilcloth-wrapped copies in the cellar were exactly where she'd hidden them, unburned, undiscovered. She sat on the ground near the creek bank where she'd put the children, after it was over, after Silas had come and gotten them, and made sure everyone was whole. She sat on the cold ground with her back against the cottonwood roots in her lap, and the children were with Silas, and the fire had burned down to something manageable, and the fence rail was somewhere in the yard. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed until she sat down. She let herself shake for exactly as long as it took her to get her breathing back to something regular. Then she pressed her palms flat against her thighs and made herself still. Ethan came and sat down near her, not next to her, a few feet away, the same kind of respectful distance she'd maintained with people throughout her life. He sat with his knees up and looked out at the ruined barn. "You went back?" he said. "Yes." "That was—" He stopped, looked at the barn. "You didn't have to." "I know." A pause. "Those men work for Blackwood," he said. He'd heard enough, seen enough in the last hour to have put it together. He was 16 and he'd figured it out before anyone explained it to him. "Almost certainly," she said. Another pause. Longer. "My mother found something," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet. In the ruined dark, with the smell of smoke and the sound of the creek, and his father's voice somewhere behind them, settling the younger children, she let Ethan Crow sit with the shape of what he was beginning to understand. She tried to stop it, he said finally. She did, Evelyn said. She got a long way toward stopping it. He didn't say anything after that for a long time. Then he got up and went to help his father. She sat alone for another few minutes. The shaking had stopped. Her hands were steady. She thought about Clara Crow, who had pressed hard on her pen and hidden her evidence under the floor and died trying to protect a family she loved. She thought about what it meant that those men had come tonight, that Blackwood knew or suspected that someone at this ranch was getting close to something, that the fire was meant to burn the evidence and possibly discourage anyone from talking, that it had failed. She was still here, the papers were still here, and Silas had to get to San Antonio. That was the morning's problem. She picked herself up from the cold ground and walked back toward the house. The morning after the fire smelled like wet ash and scorched wood, and it settled over everything, the yard, the house, the clothes they were wearing, the way bad news settles, which is to say it didn't lift. Silas was up before dawn. Evelyn heard him moving through the house and was already in the kitchen by the time he came through, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept at all, but had spent the dark hours making decisions. He looked at her across the room and she looked at him, and neither of them wasted time on the obvious things: the barn, the men, the close margin of the night before. "I have to leave today," he said. "I know. San Antonio, I can't wait." He pulled out the chair and sat, not because he wanted to sit, but because he needed to think through the sequence out loud, and sitting helped him do that. "If they came last night, it means someone told Blackwood we've been asking questions. Ferris, maybe. I don't think Ferris talked, but someone in Caldwell Creek saw me at his place. The longer I wait, the more time Blackwood has to get ahead of this." "The originals are in the tin box," Evelyn said. "The copies are in the cellar. I'll give you both." "I'm taking the originals to the commissioner. You keep the copies here." He looked at her. "Separate locations. If something happens on the road, the copies stay," she said. "I understand." He was quiet for a moment. The first pale light was starting at the window. "I need you to stay with the children." She'd expected that. She'd thought about it in the hours before dawn, lying awake with her hand on the skillet and the smell of smoke still in the air. She'd thought about all the things that could happen while Silas was on the road for 3 days each direction, with a ranch that was now known to be holding evidence against a man who'd already sent people with fire once. "Ethan," she said, "he needs to know everything, not the edges of it, everything. He's old enough and he's capable enough. And if something happens here while you're gone, he needs to be able to make real decisions." Silas considered this. She could see him weighing it, the instinct to protect his son from the full weight of what was happening against the practical reality that partial knowledge was more dangerous than complete knowledge when danger was already inside the perimeter. "All right," he said. They told Ethan together, at the kitchen table, before the younger children woke. Evelyn laid out the papers the way she'd done for Silas, methodically, in order, without softening the parts that were hard. Ethan sat across from them and listened the way she'd come to expect from him, which was with complete attention and a face that gave nothing away until he'd decided what to do with what he was hearing. When she got to the part about Clara's water samples, about Ferris's confirmation, Ethan's jaw tightened. When she explained the timeline, the contamination, the accumulation, the speed of Clara's illness, something moved behind his eyes that she looked away from because it was private. He didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. Then, "Blackwood killed her." "The evidence points to it," Silas said. "Not directly. But he put the compound in the water and your mother drank it and—" "Yes." Ethan looked at the table, at the papers, at nothing. "What do you need me to do?" he said finally. Silas told him. The conversation was practical and specific. Keep the children inside as much as possible. Keep the rifle accessible and loaded. Don't go into town. Don't talk to anyone about where Silas had gone. If anyone came to the property, anyone, even someone they knew, they were to be turned away politely without information. Ethan listened to every word. Then he looked at Evelyn. "And her?" he said. Not dismissive, just direct. "She's in charge," Silas said. Ethan nodded once. No argument, no qualification. Evelyn noted this and said nothing about it. Silas left 2 hours after sunrise. He took his best horse, the originals in a flat leather satchel under his coat, and a week's worth of food Evelyn had put together from what the kitchen had left. He paused in the yard before mounting. He looked at the burned section of the barn, and then at the house, and then at her, standing on the porch with June beside her, and Miles behind them being held back by Thomas, because Miles had decided he wanted to say goodbye, and Thomas thought it would take too long. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do," Silas said. "That's a wide field," she said. It was close to a joke. It was the closest they'd come to one directly. He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't nothing either, and then he mounted and rode north. She stood on the porch until he was out of sight. June stood beside her and didn't say anything, and the two of them watched the road together until it was just road. The first 2 days were quiet, in the way that makes the back of your neck itch. She kept the children on a regular schedule because routine was the best thing she knew how to offer, and because she needed them occupied and not frightened. Miles was loud and restless, and twice tried to go out to the yard beyond the fence line, which she stopped both times without explaining all the reasons why. He complained about it with the specific indignation of a 10-year-old being told no without sufficient justification, and she let him complain because it was better than the alternative. Thomas picked up the slack the way he always did, quietly, practically, without being asked. He took over the morning water and the feeding of what remained of the livestock, and he did it with an efficiency that sometimes made her forget he was 13. June watched Evelyn. That was what June did. Watched, calculated, filed things away. She'd been doing it since the first day, and Evelyn had gotten used to it and mostly stopped noticing. But in those 2 days after Silas left, June's watching had a different quality. Less evaluating, more something else, like she was making a decision that had been pending for a long time. On the second morning, June came into the kitchen before the others were up and stood by the table until Evelyn noticed her. "You went back," June said, the same words Ethan had used the night of the fire. "Yes," Evelyn said. "You didn't have to." "Your brother said the same thing." June was quiet for a moment. "Ethan says things when he means them. He doesn't say them otherwise." "I know." Another pause. June reached out and touched the handle of the iron skillet, which was on the stove where it always was, the way another person might touch a piece of furniture they'd decided to stop resenting. "My mother had a skillet," she said. "It cracked. Papa couldn't find another one that was any good." "This one's been in my family a long time," Evelyn said. June took her hand off the handle. She looked at Evelyn with those dark, direct eyes. "I'm glad you went back," she said, and she walked out of the kitchen before Evelyn could answer. She stood at the stove for a moment. Then she turned back to the fire and got on with breakfast. On the third day, the man from town came. She saw him from the kitchen window before he reached the yard. A man she didn't recognize, on a horse she didn't know, riding at the unhurried pace of someone who wanted to appear like he had no particular purpose. She'd learned enough in her life about men who moved like they had no purpose to know that was exactly when you paid the most attention. She went to find Ethan before the man reached the fence. Ethan was already on the porch. "I see him," Ethan said quietly. They stood together at the edge of the porch. Behind them, she'd sent Thomas to get the younger children inside without explanation. Thomas had understood immediately and gone without a word. The man reined up outside the fence. He was in his 40s, weathered, with a neat hat and the kind of clothes that were better quality than they were trying to look. He had a smile that had been practiced until it looked natural. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for Silas Crow. He around?" "He's not here," Ethan said. "Know when he'll be back?" "No." The man's smile stayed in place. His eyes moved to Evelyn, and she looked back at him steadily and said nothing. "I've got some business I was hoping to discuss with him," the man said. "Land matter. Nothing urgent, but I'd like to make sure he gets the message." "I can pass a message along," Ethan said. "Appreciate it." He reached into his coat. Ethan's hand moved slightly, barely, toward the fence post where the rifle was leaning out of immediate sight, and Evelyn calculated the distance and decided she was close enough to the post herself to cover it, and pulled out a folded paper. "This is from Mr. Blackwood. He's got a standing offer on this property. Good price, fair terms. Be worth Crow's time to look at it." He held the paper out over the fence. Neither of them moved to take it. The man waited. The smile stayed. I'll tell him someone came by, Ethan said. The paper went back into the man's coat. Something behind his eyes adjusted. Not the smile, not the posture, just a slight recalibration. He looked at the burned section of the barn. He looked at the house. He looked at Evelyn one more time. Shame about the fire, he said. You folks all right? We're fine, she said. Her voice was level, and she kept her hands visible and loose and met his eyes without a blink. He touched his hat, turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, at the same unhurried pace. She and Ethan stood on the porch until he was off the property. He'll report back, Ethan said. Yes. What do we do? She thought about the copies in the cellar. She thought about Silas on the road to San Antonio. She thought about the children inside and the rifle and the distance to any neighbor who might help. We make it look like everything's normal, she said. Routine, visible work. Don't hide in the house. That looks like fear. We keep moving, we keep working, and we don't give anyone watching anything to act on. Ethan turned his head slightly to look at her. You've thought about this. I've had time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to get the rifle and carry it with him to the fence line, where there was actual work to do, and she went inside to check on the children. Silas had been gone 5 days when Nora stopped eating. It wasn't dramatic. There was no scene, no crying, no defiance. She simply stopped finishing her meals and started sleeping more than she should, and Evelyn noticed it on the second day because she noticed everything in this household. And by the third day, the fear had moved from the back of her mind to the front. She sat with Nora that evening, just the two of them in the small bedroom with the lamp low and the glove on the pillow beside Nora's head. She put her hand on Nora's forehead. No fever. She looked at her color. Not bad, just pale. The kind of pale that came from being upset and small and not old enough to understand what was happening, except that her father had gone away and the barn had burned and there were things in the adults' faces that the adults didn't explain. Are you hurting somewhere? Evelyn asked. Nora shook her head. Your stomach? Another shake. Are you scared? A pause, then a very small nod. Evelyn looked at her, 4 years old, holding a dead woman's glove, because it was the closest she could get to her mother, and now her father was gone and the world kept doing frightening things. Your papa is coming back, Evelyn said. She said it with the specific weight of a promise, not a comfort. She said it the way you say things you intend to be held to. He's going to be back in a few days, and when he gets back, you can tell him everything that scared you while he was gone. Nora looked at her. What if something happens to him? He's very careful, Evelyn said, and he's doing something important. He's making things safer for all of you. Like what Mama did? The question landed in the quiet room and stayed there. Evelyn kept her face steady. She thought about what to say and then said the truth, which was usually the right choice with children who were old enough to know when they were being managed. Yes, like what your mama did. Your mama was very brave. Your papa is being brave too. Nora was quiet for a moment. She picked up the glove and held it to her chest. Then she said, with the directness of someone who has decided to trust you, will you stay until he's back? Yes, Evelyn said. I'm not going anywhere. Nora closed her eyes. She ate a small bowl of porridge an hour later, which wasn't much, but it was enough. Silas came back on the 8th day. He rode in mid-afternoon, and she was in the kitchen garden when she heard the hoofbeats and looked up and saw him coming up the north road. And something in her chest that had been held tight for 8 days released like a fist unclenching. She made herself walk to the yard rather than run. Running was not practical, and she had developed strong feelings about practicality. The children heard the horse and came out faster than she did. Miles reached him first, with the momentum of a 10-year-old who has been containing himself for a week, and Silas swung down from the horse and caught him with one arm without breaking stride, which was a feat, because Miles was not a small child. He looked over their heads and found Evelyn standing in the yard. He looked tired in the way of someone who has been through something difficult and come out the other side still intact. He nodded at her once, a specific nod, not just acknowledgement, the kind that said, it worked, it happened. She let out the breath she'd been halfway holding since he left. Later, after the children were fed and the younger ones in bed, he told her what had happened in San Antonio. The Federal Land Commissioner's office had received him, had taken the document seriously, had recognized Ferris's name, had immediately seen the scope of what Clara's records documented. They had their own suspicions about Blackwood already. Apparently, he was not unknown in those offices, but they had lacked exactly what Clara had spent her last months assembling: evidence, specifics, dates and names and measurements. They'd kept the originals. They'd given Silas a receipt in the name of the commissioner who would be handling it and a timeline. Weeks, not months. There would be an inquiry. There would be federal investigators coming to look at the watershed. It's out of our hands now, Silas said. Is that good? She asked. He thought about it. It means we're not the only ones holding it anymore, he said. Blackwood can burn our barn again. He can't burn a federal office in San Antonio. She nodded. That was the right way to think about it. The man who came, she said. Blackwood's man, with the offer. Ethan told me. He'll know the documents have been moved. He probably already knows. Then he knows it's done, Silas said. Burning us out now won't fix what's already filed. She thought about that. It was true. And it was also the kind of truth that didn't necessarily make dangerous men stop being dangerous. He may not think rationally about it, she said. Silas looked at her. No, he might not. They both understood what that meant. A man with Blackwood's reach, watching his operation about to unravel. The investigators coming. The records already filed. The county sheriff unable to contain it anymore. That kind of man had a choice between accepting the consequence and escalating. And men like Blackwood, in her experience, did not go quietly. We have to be in town when the investigators come, she said. Visible, on record. You and Ferris and Josiah's written testimony all in one place, in front of witnesses. The commissioner said they'd send word when they're coming. Then we wait, she said, and in the meantime we stay careful. He agreed. They didn't say much else that night. She went to bed and lay on the cot and thought about the days ahead, and for the first time in a while she let herself also think about something she'd been keeping to the margins. What happened after? What this place was, to her, now. What she was to it. She didn't have clean answers. She wasn't sure she needed them yet. The word from San Antonio came 12 days later, carried by a rider she didn't recognize who turned out to be a deputy working for the commissioner's office. Investigators were arriving in Caldwell Creek in 4 days. Silas Crow was asked to present himself and the parties to the evidence at the county land office at 9 in the morning. 4 days. They used the time the way she'd learned to use every resource on this ranch, carefully, without waste. Silas sent a rider to Ferris in Caldwell Creek with word of the timing. He wrote himself to speak to 2 of the surviving neighboring ranchers, the Farlows, who had sold their land at a loss and were still in the county, and an older man named Grange who had refused to sell no matter what pressure was applied and had therefore suffered for it in ways he hadn't talked about publicly. Both of them, Silas said when he came back, were willing to come. Both of them had stories that corroborated what Clara's records showed. Evelyn spent the days doing what she'd been doing since she arrived, keeping the household running. But there was a different quality to those 4 days. The children were quieter, aware that something was building without being told directly. June helped in the kitchen without being asked. Thomas checked and rechecked the fence line. Miles stayed in the yard. On the 3rd day, Ethan came to her in the late afternoon. She was sitting on the back step, mending a shirt of Thomas's that had blown off the line and snagged on the fence wire, and Ethan came and sat on the step beside her. Not a foot away, not 2 feet, actually beside her, and didn't say anything for a moment. She would have liked you, he said finally. She kept her needle moving. You don't know that. I knew her. She looked at him. He was looking out at the yard, his profile sharp in the late light. She didn't have patience for people who pretended things were fine when they weren't, he said. She said it was a waste of everyone's time. He paused. You never pretend things are fine. Evelyn thought about this. I was raised to be quiet about things, she said. That's not the same as pretending. I know the difference, Ethan said. She believed him. He did know the difference. He always had. I was wrong about you, he said. It came out without preamble, without building to it. Just said, I want you to know I know that. She looked at him for a moment, this proud, difficult, capable boy who had been carrying grief and protecting his family from the day his mother died, who had made her life hard from the first day because he didn't know how else to hold what he'd lost. You were protecting them, she said. That's not wrong. I wasn't fair to you. No, she agreed, but I understood it. He nodded. That was what she'd learned about Ethan. He didn't need to be let off the hook. and letting him off the hook would have been the wrong thing. He needed honesty, the same thing his mother had apparently needed, and the same thing Evelyn herself had always preferred. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. The question sat between them in the evening air. She threaded the needle through the shirt fabric and made 2 careful stitches before she answered. "That's not a simple question," she said. "I know." "I'd like to," she said. And then, because she owed him the same honesty she'd been holding out as a standard, "This is the first place I've been where the work I do matters to the people it's for. Not just as a convenience, actually matters." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "It does," he said. She nodded. She went back to her mending. He stayed on the step for another few minutes without talking, the two of them sitting in the cooling air with the sound of the ranch around them. Miles somewhere inside, the cattle in the pasture. June's voice calling Nora in from the front yard. Then he got up and went inside. The morning they drove to Caldwell Creek was overcast, the sky the pale gray of a day that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. Silas drove the wagon with the tin box, the copies now, since the originals were in San Antonio, under the seat. Thomas sat up front with his father. Evelyn rode in the bed with Nora in her lap, and June on one side and Miles on the other. Ethan rode alongside on horseback because he'd decided he was doing that, and there was no argument made that he listened to. She'd debated whether to bring the children. In the end, she'd brought them all, because leaving them at the ranch alone was worse, and because what was about to happen in that county land office was something she thought they ought to witness. Something Clara had started and spent her last months building toward, alone, in the dark hours before anyone knew what she was doing. Her children should see it concluded. They arrived in Caldwell Creek at 8:15. The town looked the same as it always looked on a weekday morning. The general store open, a few wagons on the main street, the smell of the bakery 2 doors down from the land office. But there were horses outside the land office she didn't recognize, good quality horses with federal tack, and a small group of people on the sidewalk that included Ferris, older than she'd imagined, bent and white-haired but standing very straight, and the Farlow couple, an old Grange leaning on a stick and looking like a man who has been waiting a long time for something and is prepared to wait as long as it takes. Victor Blackwood was there too. She saw him before Silas did, which was why she put her hand briefly on Silas's arm as they climbed down from the wagon, a quiet pressure that said, "Look, and look steady." He looked. She felt his arm go rigid and then deliberately relax. Blackwood was standing with 2 men she didn't know, near the far end of the sidewalk, in a posture she recognized, the posture of a man who believes that his presence in a room changes the room's calculations, and who has usually been right about that. He was well-dressed, 50 or so, heavy through the chest, with a face that had spent a long time not being challenged. He looked at Silas. Then his eyes moved to Evelyn. She'd never been looked at by someone like that before. Not directly. Not with that particular assessment, the one that started by measuring your worth and ended by deciding you didn't register. She'd been underestimated her whole life in ways large and small, by her father and her sisters and the neighbors, and every man who'd ever assumed the work she was doing was incidental. She'd learned to use being underestimated the way she used the shadows the night of the fire, as cover, as advantage. She looked back at Blackwood without expression. He dismissed her almost immediately. That was fine. She made note of the dismissal for later. The federal investigators were 2 men, a senior commissioner named Aldred, solid and gray-haired, with the careful bearing of someone who had processed a great many such cases, and a younger man who took notes and said nothing. They received everyone in the main room of the land office, which was not large enough for the number of people in it. Blackwood positioned himself near the commissioner immediately, with the ease of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in the room and had decided to continue being that. "This is a good deal of ceremony," he said to Aldred, with the tone of a man indulging something tedious. "I understand there's been some complaint about land acquisitions in the county. I'm more than happy to open my records to any inquiry." "We appreciate that," Aldred said, in the tone of someone who has heard that particular offer many times before. Silas stepped forward. He put the copies on the table, organized, the ledger on top, the letters in order, the map spread out under Aldred's hands. He said where they'd come from, whose hand they were in, how they'd been found, and when. He said it plainly, without performance, the way a man states facts he's certain of. Ferris spoke next. His voice was thin but precise, And he chose his words the way a man chooses the right tool, deliberately, one at a time. He described the water samples. He described the compound. He described what it did and at what rate and in what concentrations. He had his own papers, which he laid next to Clara's. Blackwood's expression had shifted, not broken. Men like that took longer to break than a single room could manage. But something in it had changed. The certainty had developed a flaw, somewhere around the time Ferris started talking. "These are fabrications," Blackwood said. Not loudly, carefully. The voice of a man who knows that volume is its own kind of admission. Clara Crowe was ill for months before she died. A sick woman's. "The compound Ferris identified has a specific chemical signature," Evelyn said. The room shifted. She hadn't been planning to speak. She'd been standing near the back, next to the children, watching. But the dismissal in Blackwood's voice when he said sick woman had done something in her chest, and she was across the room before she'd made a conscious decision to be. Blackwood looked at her with the expression she'd expected, the mild, slightly irritated surprise of someone being interrupted by a person they've already decided doesn't matter. "And you are?" he said. "Evelyn Mercer. I've been at the Crow Ranch since August." She looked at the commissioner. "The well on the Crow property draws from a separate source from the Alderman Creek watershed. If investigators test the fork where the piping enters the watershed and test each property downstream in sequence, the concentration will decrease predictably with distance from the source. That's consistent with what Ferris has documented." She paused. "It will also be inconsistent with any natural cause. The pattern is too specific." Aldred looked at her. "You have some knowledge of chemistry, Miss Mercer?" "No," she said. "I read Clara Crowe's notes carefully. She had the knowledge. I just followed her logic." She stepped back. Blackwood's two men were speaking to him in low voices near the wall, and his face had taken on the quality of a man running calculations that were not resolving in his favor. She watched him from the corner of her eye and thought about the fence rail in the dark, and the lamp going out in the dirt, and the children in the creek bank. She thought about Clara, who had done this alone, who had pressed hard on her pen, who had not gotten to see this room. "I want to speak to Mr. Aldred privately," Blackwood said. His voice had adjusted into something that was not quite a threat, not quite a plea. The register of a man trying to find a side door. "Of course," Aldred said, in the same even tone. "After we conclude the presentation of evidence." Blackwood's jaw tightened. He looked around the room. At Silas, at Ferris, at the Farlows and Grange, at Evelyn. She met his eyes. She didn't look away. He looked away first. The presentation continued. She went back to where the children were, and Nora reached up and took her hand without being asked, and she held it, small and warm and real, and stood and listened to the room dismantle the thing Blackwood had spent years building. It wasn't clean. It wasn't instant. She knew enough by now to know that men like Blackwood had lawyers and time and resources, and that what happened in that room in Caldwell Creek was a beginning, not an ending. That there would be more of this, more rooms, more testimony, more documents moving through offices she would never see. But the weight had been put into the right hands. Clara's evidence had found its way into the daylight after months in the dark under the floor. When Aldred dismissed the gathering and took Blackwood aside with the particular courtesy of a man who is about to explain the shape of a very bad situation, Evelyn walked out of the land office and into the gray morning. Ethan was already outside, standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets. He looked like his father when he stood that way, something she hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let herself notice. "How'd it go?" he asked, though he'd been in the room. "It went well enough," she said. He nodded. They stood there on the sidewalk for a moment while the town moved around them, ordinary and indifferent, a Tuesday in Caldwell Creek with no awareness of what had just shifted inside the land office. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "Investigators," she said. "The watershed, the county records. It takes time." "But it's done." She thought about that. She thought about Blackwood's face when he'd looked away. "The worst of it is done," she said carefully. "The rest will follow." He was quiet. Then, she'd have wanted to see that. She knew who he meant. She didn't answer right away. She looked down the main street of Caldwell Creek, at the ordinary buildings, the ordinary people, the ordinary Tuesday, and thought about a woman who had ridden alone to a creek fork, who had brought water samples back in jars, who had written things down in the dark so they wouldn't be lost. She did see it, Evelyn said. She built the whole thing. We just carried it the last part of the way. Ethan didn't say anything. But something in his face settled. Not relief exactly. Nothing as simple as that. Something older and more permanent. The kind of thing that happens when a grief finds its shape and you can finally see the edges of it. The children came out of the office, Miles first and loud as always, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did. The ride back from Caldwell Creek was quiet in the way that follows something large. Not the silence of dread, but the silence of people who have used up their words on something that mattered and haven't yet found the ordinary ones again. Miles fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder before they'd cleared the edge of town, which she hadn't expected, given that Miles approached sleep the way he approached all stillness, with suspicion and resistance. But he was out within 10 minutes, heavy and warm and entirely without self-consciousness about it, the way only children and people who are genuinely exhausted can sleep. She adjusted her arms so his head didn't roll and kept her eyes on the road ahead. Nora was awake, sitting in Evelyn's lap with the glove held loosely in one hand, and her eyes going from the passing scrubland to Evelyn's face and back again, the private rotation of a child processing something too large for her vocabulary. June sat beside them, with her knees pulled up and her arms around them, looking out the back of the wagon at the road retreating behind them. She hadn't said much since they'd left the land office. Evelyn had noticed June's face during the testimony, had watched the moment it landed on her, the moment the words Clara Crow and water and what was done came together in June's 8-year-old understanding into something she hadn't known before. There had been a very specific stillness in June's face at that moment, and Evelyn had looked away from it because some things were private even when they happened in public. Thomas was up front with Silas, and she could hear their voices occasionally, low, not quite audible, over the creak and roll of the wagon. From the tone of it, Silas was explaining something and Thomas was asking careful questions, which was exactly the conversation she'd have expected them to be having. Ethan rode alongside on the right, about a horse length back. She glanced at him once and he was looking at the horizon with the expression of someone sorting through a great deal of material. She looked back at the road. She thought about what came next, which was her habit. Always the next practical thing, the sequence of problems in order of urgency. The barn rebuild. The feed stores that had burned. The cattle count they needed to do before the season turned. The investigators who would be coming to the watershed in the coming weeks, which meant the Crow property would have people on it she didn't know, asking questions, looking at things. She needed to be prepared for that. She needed Silas to be prepared for it. She thought about all of this and then, underneath it, she thought about Ethan's question on the step. Are you going to stay? She'd answered honestly. She'd like to. This was the first place where her work mattered to the people it was for. But liking to stay and having the terms of staying sorted out were different things, and they hadn't been sorted out. What she was here on, but the arrangement with Pruitt, the debt, the cattle equivalent of her value to her father, that was still the legal reality of her situation, even if she and Silas had talked about it differently on the porch all those weeks ago. She'd said she wanted it to be a choice. He'd said all right. But all right wasn't paperwork, and she'd learned enough in her life about the distance between words and documents. She didn't bring any of this up on the ride home. The ride home was not the moment. The moment came 3 days later, on a Sunday morning when the chores were done early and the children had dispersed to their various corners of the afternoon. She found Silas at the fence on the north pasture, doing a repair she'd been watching him plan for 2 weeks, and she walked out and stood nearby until he noticed her. He set down the hammer. He looked at her face and waited, the way he'd learned to wait, without rushing her, without filling the space prematurely. I need to know what my situation is, she said. Legally, with Pruitt. He was quiet for a moment. I talked to Pruitt when I was in town last week. She hadn't known that. And? The debt is settled. He looked at the fence line. Claire and I had some savings I hadn't touched. I used part of it. Pruitt's claim on your service is done. She stood there. You should have told me, she said. I know. He turned to look at her. I was trying to figure out how to say it without it sounding like something it's not. What's it not? It's not me buying you out of one situation and into another one. He said it directly, without flinching from it. You said you wanted it to be a choice. Your choice. So I settled the debt because that was my obligation. Pruitt had no business making that arrangement with your father to begin with, and that was mine to fix. But what you do after that is yours." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and pale, the kind that made the land look exactly like what it was. Not romantic, not particularly kind, just real and large and indifferent to what people decided in the middle of it. "And what would you like me to do?" she asked, because it was a fair question, and she'd learned that asking fair questions directly was almost always better than waiting for the answer to emerge on its own. Silas picked up the hammer again, turned it over in his hands. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as a hired hand and not as an arrangement, as—" He stopped, tried to find the word, and didn't quite find it. "As someone who belongs here, if you want to." "That's not a small thing to offer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked out at the pasture, at the cattle moving slow and aimless in the afternoon warmth, at the repaired sections of fence alongside the sections still waiting, at the house behind her from which she could faintly hear Miles arguing with someone about something, the specific pitch of a disagreement that wasn't serious enough to require intervention. "I'm not Clara," she said. Not as a warning, just as a fact that needed to be in the air between them. "I know that," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, certain, a little tired, told her he'd already spent considerable time with that distinction and had arrived somewhere honest about it. "And I'm not the girl my father traded away," she said. "I'm not that anymore if I ever entirely was." "No," Silas said. "You're not." She thought about her grandmother, about the iron skillet, about all the things that got handed down not because they were valuable to anyone else, but because they carried something in their weight that mattered. "I'll stay," she said. He nodded. He went back to the fence. She stood there for a moment longer, looking at the land, and then she turned and walked back toward the house. The federal investigators arrived 5 weeks after Caldwell Creek, 2 of them plus a third man who was some kind of water engineer. They spent 4 days on the watershed, testing the fork, following the pipe trace upstream, documenting the contamination source and its reach. Evelyn kept the household running through all of it and answered their questions when they came to the ranch house, which they did twice, and she answered them clearly and without embellishment and directed them to Silas for the property-specific questions. On the 3rd day, the engineer came back from the fork with the pipes fully traced. The source was on land. Blackwood had acquired 2 years prior, a parcel he'd held for exactly as long as the contamination had been building in the watershed. That connection, laid out in the investigators' formal notes alongside Clara's records alongside Ferris's chemistry, was the kind of evidence that didn't leave interpretive room. Blackwood's lawyers had been busy in San Antonio. She heard pieces of this from Silas, who heard pieces from Grange, who seemed to have a talent for knowing what was happening at the county office, even from a distance. There was going to be a legal process. There was always going to be a legal process. And it would be slow and expensive, and Blackwood would fight it through every available mechanism, because men like Blackwood had the resources to make losing take a very long time. But the outcome was not in doubt. The commissioner had said as much, quietly, to Silas in the land office hallway after the official presentation. "This is solid," he'd said. "This is the kind of thing that doesn't go away. Clara's records didn't go away. Ferris's testimony didn't go away. The pipes in the ground, the chemical signature, the 17 land transfers in 14 months. None of it went away." Evelyn thought about this on the 4th evening, sitting on the front porch after the investigators had gone for the day. She thought about the fact that evidence was only as good as the people willing to carry it forward, that Clara had done the hard and dangerous work of gathering it, and that it could have been lost a dozen different ways. Under the floor forever. Burned in the barn. Ignored by a commissioner who had other priorities. She thought about all the thin margins it had come through on. June came out and sat beside her on the porch step. Just sat, the way she did things now. Without asking permission, without explaining herself. She'd gotten that from somewhere in the last few months. Evelyn suspected she'd had it all along and had only recently decided it was safe to show. "Are they going to put him in jail?" June asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said. "There'll be a trial. Maybe. But he'll lose what he took." "Yes," she said. "The land he acquired through this, that gets looked at. The families who were pushed out, some of them may get it back. Not all of them. It depends." The Farlows? Possibly. June was quiet for a moment. Mama would have wanted them to get it back. She knew Mrs. Farlow. I know. June looked out at the yard. The evening was cooling fast, the way evenings did in fall. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun started going, and you always underestimated it until you were cold. Do you think she knew how it would go? June asked. When she was writing everything down, did she think it would work? Evelyn thought about the letters. About the unfinished sentence. He said if someone had been drinking from a contaminated source for months, and how Clara had stopped there and not written the end of it, about the way she'd pressed hard on her pen. I think she knew it might not, Evelyn said. I think she did it anyway. June considered this. That's braver than if she knew it would work, she said. Evelyn looked at her, this 8-year-old with her precise vocabulary and her dark eyes, and the way she'd touched the skillet handle that morning in the kitchen, months ago now, and said, I'm glad you went back. Yes, she said. It is. June leaned sideways until her shoulder was against Evelyn's arm, a slight warm pressure. She didn't say anything else. They sat like that until the chill got too real, and they went inside. Victor Blackwood's formal indictment came in the early spring, 4 months after Caldwell Creek. Silas came back from town with the news on a Tuesday and told Evelyn before he told the children, which had become a habit between them. Not because the children couldn't handle things, but because there was something in those few minutes of telling her first that they'd both stopped examining too closely. The charges were substantial: land fraud, conspiracy, and the one that had taken the longest to build but had finally been built, using Ferris's chemistry and Clara's timeline and the records of 3 other deaths in the watershed over the same period, criminal negligence resulting in death. He would fight it. His lawyers were already fighting it. But the federal machinery had started moving, and it moved with a particular kind of thoroughness that Evelyn had come to understand didn't care much about the size of the man in front of it. Clara's name will be in the record, Silas said. They were in the kitchen, the children outside. He was standing near the window, and she was at the table. Officially, what she found, what she documented, they're citing her evidence in the formal complaint. She looked at him. His face was complicated, things moving through it she wasn't going to try to name. She'll be part of the public record, he said, what she did. Good, Evelyn said, simply because that was the right word. He looked out the window. The yard was visible from where he stood. Thomas moving along the fence line, Miles doing something that looked vaguely like helping and probably wasn't. The corner of the new barn visible at the edge. The barn had been rebuilt over the winter, better than the first one, with lumber. Thomas had helped source, and Ethan had spent 3 consecutive Saturdays putting up with 2 men from the neighboring property who'd come to help without being asked. I told the children this morning, Silas said, about Clara, about what she found. He was still looking out the window. All of it. I should have told them sooner. You told them when you could, she said. Ethan already knew most of it. June. He stopped. June said she already knew too. Evelyn waited. She said she figured it out from watching you, he said, when you were copying the papers. She said she knew something was important from the way you did it. She thought about June at the kitchen table. June watching everything, filing everything, drawing her conclusions from the specific quality of people's attention rather than their words. She's going to be that girl, Evelyn said. She already is, Silas said. He turned from the window and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And there was a moment that was not about the indictment or Clara or the spring or any of the practical things. Just a moment of 2 people in the same place, seeing each other. Thank you, he said. She shook her head slightly. Don't, he said. I mean it. Not for the ranch, not for the barn, not for any of the things I can list. He seemed to run out of words, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who ran out of words often. He was a man who used them selectively, and running out meant he'd reached the edge of what selection could do. For staying, he said finally. For making a choice to stay when you didn't have to. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what she would have said a year ago if someone had described this house and this man and these 5 children and told her she'd end up here. That she would choose it, without a debt attached, without anyone making her. She thought about the version of herself who'd stood in her father's yard listening to him tell her she was leaving, with the egg bucket in her hand and nothing in her chest but that cold, quiet recognition. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "Not at first." "I know. I did it because the work needed doing and it was work I could do." She paused. "But it changed. At some point it changed." "I know that too," he said. She believed him. Spring came in fast that year after a dry winter. The land went from gray to yellow-green in what felt like 2 weeks, and the kitchen garden she'd salvaged the previous summer came back stronger than she'd expected, the bean plants sending up new runners before she'd even gotten around to checking the soil. She spent a morning clearing the winter debris from the rows and found, in the back corner where the wild onions had crept in from the field edge, that they'd spread significantly. She left them. They were better than the cultivated ones, and they clearly intended to stay. Nora followed her into the garden that morning and sat on the edge of the bed and watched her work with the same serious attention she'd applied to everything since the day she'd climbed onto the bench to watch the mending. She'd started talking more in the last few months, not loudly, not like Miles, but steadily, in the particular way of a child who chooses her words because she's been paying attention to what words do. The glove was still with her. It lived now in the pocket of whichever dress she was wearing, or on the pillow when she slept, or held in her hand when things felt uncertain. Evelyn had never said anything about it, had never suggested Nora put it away, had never implied it was time to stop. She thought it wasn't her place to decide when a child was done needing the thing that connected her to her mother. "The onions came back," Nora observed. "They did. Do you like onions?" "Depends on what they're for," Evelyn said. "In soup, yes. Eaten raw, not particularly." Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to all questions of preference. "I like them in soup too," she said, "but not when they're big. When they're big, they're too slippery. You can cut them smaller." "Oh." Nora turned this over. "Did you know that before, or did someone teach you?" Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at the child. "Someone taught me," she said. "My grandmother." "Is she here?" "No, she died when I was about your brother Thomas's age." Nora thought about this. "Do you miss her?" "Yes," Evelyn said, "but she taught me things that I still use, so she's not entirely gone." Nora reached into her pocket and touched the glove. The gesture was automatic, the way you reach for something without thinking. She looked down at her pocket for a moment and then back up at Evelyn. "Like the skillet," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "You brought it from before," Nora said, "from the person who taught you, and you use it here." She was 4 years old, almost 5 now, Evelyn had learned. Her birthday was in June. She was 4 years old, and she had just said something that Evelyn didn't have an immediate answer for. "Yes," Evelyn said finally, "exactly like the skillet." Nora nodded as though this had resolved something that had been pending. She went back to watching the garden. After a while, she started pulling out small weeds from the nearest row, slowly and carefully, without being asked. The trial, when it came, was in the county seat and took 11 days. Silas attended most of it. Evelyn attended 3 of the days, the ones where Clara's evidence was formally entered into the record, where Ferris testified, where the engineer described the water testing findings in terms that left the courtroom silent in a particular way. She sat in the gallery and listened and took nothing personally and watched Blackwood's face when the evidence landed. He had aged. That was her first thought when she saw him in the courtroom, on the first day she attended. He'd aged in the months since the land office in Caldwell Creek, not dramatically, not the way people aged in stories, but in the specific way real men aged when the thing they'd built started coming apart. A little grayer, a little smaller in the posture. The certainty that had made him large in every room he entered now rationed, carefully maintained rather than natural. His lawyers were skilled. They worked every available angle, challenged the chain of evidence custody, questioned Ferris's methodology, argued that the land transfers were legal transactions freely entered. Some of it landed well enough to create complications. Not all of it. Clara's letters were read aloud on the 7th day. The reading was done by a court officer in a flat professional voice that drained them of the quality they'd had when Evelyn read them by lamplight on the cot. The urgency, the precision, the weight of a woman who knew she was running out of time. But the content was the content. What is in the water at the fork is a compound used in industrial mining operations to leach minerals from rock. It accumulates. It kills cattle slowly. It kills people slowly, too. Clara's words. In the public record. In a courtroom. Read by a man who had never met her. Evelyn sat very still during the reading. Silas was beside her. She felt his stillness, too, the kind that costs something to maintain. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They sat together in the public gallery of a county courthouse and listened to Clara's words finally find their audience, the audience Clara had been trying to reach from under the floorboards of her own house. The verdict came on the 11th day. Guilty on fraud, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on criminal negligence resulting in death. The last charge carried the most weight and also the most uncertainty. Blackwood's lawyers had made the argument that correlation wasn't causation, that Clara's death could not be definitively attributed to the compound. The jury didn't find that argument persuasive. Evelyn thought about what June had said on the porch. That's braver than if she knew it would work. Clara had gathered her evidence without knowing this moment would come. And the moment had come anyway. Blackwood's land acquisitions were subject to federal review. Several of the transfers were vacated. The Farlows got their property back. Not entirely, not in the condition it had been, but substantially, enough to start again from. Old Grange, who hadn't sold, had his standing confirmed and his legal costs recovered. Other families were still in the process, working through the slow machinery of restitution, which was not fast and was not always complete, but was moving. She heard all of this in pieces, from Silas, from Thomas, who had started going to town with his father and paying close attention to what he heard there, from the occasional neighbor who stopped by with news. The world of the ranch was larger than it had been the autumn she arrived. The fence was repaired, the barn was rebuilt. There were new cattle and a functioning kitchen garden and a household that had found the shape of what it was. Not perfect. She'd been emphatic with herself about that from the beginning, and it was still true. Ethan was not always easy. He never would be, and she didn't expect him to be. He was growing into someone who held his own counsel and pushed back when he disagreed, and those were qualities she respected even when they made things harder. Thomas was steady and reliable and occasionally so self-sufficient that she worried about him, the way you worried about children who were too good at not asking for help. Miles was exhausting in all the ways he'd always been exhausting, and she had made her private peace with that. June watched everything and trusted slowly, and had started in recent months to occasionally ask Evelyn for things, advice, opinions, help with a specific problem, in the quiet, direct way of someone who has decided trust is worth the risk. Nora still had the glove, but she'd stopped holding it constantly. Now she carried it in her pocket the way Evelyn's grandmother had carried certain things. Not because she couldn't put them down, but because she chose not to. There was a difference, and Evelyn understood it. A year after she'd arrived at the Crow Ranch, on an evening in late August that was warm and smelled like the end of summer, Evelyn sat on the front porch with Silas. This was unremarkable. They did this often. The children in bed or close to it, the day's work finished, the two of them on the porch with the night sounds around them. They had gotten, over the course of a year, comfortable in each other's company in the specific way of people who have been through something difficult together and come out on the other side still standing. It wasn't easy, exactly. Silas was not a simple man to know, and she was not a woman who made herself easy to know. But it was honest, and honest was better than easy in her experience. "My father sent a letter," she said. Silas looked at her. Through Pruitt, apparently. Pruitt forwarded it. She'd received it that morning, read it in the kitchen before anyone else was up. She'd put it in her apron pocket and thought about it all day. "He heard about the trial, about Blackwood. He says he's proud of what I did." Silas waited. "He also mentioned that the Mercer farm had a bad season, and that if I had any ability to send something back—" She stopped. The phrasing had been so her father, so perfectly her father, that she'd almost laughed reading it. Almost. "What are you going to do?" Silas asked. She thought about the morning she'd stood in the yard with an egg bucket and asked her father how much, and he'd told her it wasn't her concern. She thought about standing at the sink with soapy water going cold around her hands. She thought about driving away in a wagon driven by a man who didn't offer conversation, watching the landscape change. "I'm going to write him back," she said. "I'm going to tell him I hope the season improves." She paused. "I'm not going to send money." Silas nodded. She looked out at the yard. The new barn was dark against the sky, solid and angular.
The fence along the north pasture was intact. The cottonwood by the creek was still standing, the one whose roots had sheltered the children on the night of the fire, and it would be standing long after everything else that had happened this year had settled into the kind of history that was mostly felt rather than spoken about. "He'll never understand it," she said, "what he did. Not really. He'll tell himself the story where he made a practical decision in a hard time, and I ended up in a good situation, and it worked out." She said this without bitterness. That was the thing she'd come to, somewhere in the months between arriving and now. Not forgiveness exactly, not the kind that asked her to revise what had happened, just a kind of clarity. Her father was who he was, and who he was had sent her here, and here was where she'd chosen to stay. Those two things could both be true. "He'll die thinking he didn't do anything wrong," she said. "Does that bother you?" Silas asked.
She considered it honestly. "Less than it used to," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "What bothers you now?" She thought about that. It was the kind of question he asked occasionally, direct and without warning, the way a man built from practical work asked things, as if there was no sense in going around. "Nothing urgent," she said. "I'm working on the south fence section. The beans are finishing and I need to get the bed turned before it frosts. Ethan told me he wants us to try adding to the herd in the spring, which I think is right, but we need to sort out the pasture rotation before that makes sense." She paused. "Nora's birthday is in June. I'd like to do something for it this year." Silas looked at her with that expression she'd cataloged by now, the one where he was recalibrating something, updating the account he kept of who she was. "I meant," he started.
"I know what you meant," she said. "And the answer is nothing urgent. Things I think about. Nothing I can't carry." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to carry things alone," he said. "You know that." She looked at him. He was not a man given to declarations, which made the things he said carry more weight than they might have from someone else. She'd learned to listen to him the way she listened to everything in this household, with the specific attention of someone who understood that the important things were usually said simply. "I know," she said. They sat for a while longer without talking. The night settled around them. The cricket sound, the faint noise of the cattle in the far pasture, the creak of the barn. She thought about the girl who had arrived here a year ago with a bag of plain dresses and her grandmother's skillet, who had been sent away because she was considered worth less than a herd of cattle, who had walked into a stranger's kitchen and made potato soup with everything she had. She didn't recognize that girl entirely. And she didn't not recognize her. The truth was something in between, which was where the truth usually lived. She was still the person who had stood at that sink with cold water around her hands. She was also the person who had knocked a man down in the dark with a fence rail and stood in a courtroom and watched Clara Crow's words outlast the man who had tried to silence them. She was both, and she'd stopped trying to figure out which one was the real version. They were both real. That was what she'd learned, maybe, above all the practical things, above the fence repairs and the well water and the evidence and the legal machinery grinding forward. That people were not one thing, not a burden, not a treasure, not weak, not strong, not the girl traded away and not the woman who became a legend. All of it, at once, in the complicated and imperfect way that actual lives refuse to be reduced. Her grandmother had known this. Clara had known it, pressing hard on her pen in the dark hours. Evelyn had been learning it since the day she arrived. There is something particular about the people the world dismisses first. Not because being dismissed makes them stronger. That's too clean, too easy a story, and it isn't true. Being dismissed is damaging. It sits in you and takes up space, and it takes years of work to stop letting it define what you believe about yourself. Nobody comes out of that kind of thing without marks. But the people who are handed nothing, who are told they are worth less than a debt, who arrive in broken places with a bag of plain clothes and a grandmother's cast iron pan, those people have had to develop a particular kind of attention. They learn to read rooms, to see what needs doing before they're told, to solve problems with what's available rather than what's ideal. They learn patience, because impatience is a luxury. They learn to hold on to things that matter and let go of things that don't, because they never had the room to carry unnecessary weight. Evelyn Mercer had all of that. She'd had it since she was 12 years old and making herself small in her father's house. She just hadn't had anywhere to put it that mattered. The frontier doesn't care about your status. It doesn't care what your father thought you were worth.
It cares whether you can read the weather and fix the fence and keep the fire going and make something out of very little when there is very little to make something out of. It cares whether you'll still be there in the morning. She was still there. She intended to keep being there. That summer, when the south fence was repaired and the bean bed was turned and Ethan had started talking seriously with Silas about the spring herd expansion, Evelyn Mercer became Evelyn Crow. It was not a large ceremony. Thomas stood up straight and looked like he was trying not to show how much it meant to him. Miles cried, which he denied immediately and at length. June stood beside Evelyn and held her hand through the whole thing, small and warm and deliberate, the way June did everything. Ethan stood on his father's side and looked at Evelyn across the small room with an expression she had no name for except that it was honest, and honesty from Ethan was the most valuable currency he had. And Nora, who had turned 5 in June and had started leaving the glove on her pillow some mornings when she got up, who had started asking questions in the particular relentless way of a child discovering that the world answers back. Nora reached into her pocket and took out the glove and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked to Evelyn and held it out. Evelyn looked down at it, at the soft brown leather worn to the shape of a hand that was no longer there. "You should keep it," Evelyn said quietly. Nora shook her head, not with distress, with certainty, with the expression of a child who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at a conclusion. "I know where she is," Nora said. "I don't need to hold it anymore." Evelyn took the glove. She held it carefully, the way you hold things that aren't yours but have been trusted to you. She thought about Clara, who had pressed hard on her pen and hidden her evidence and tried to protect this family from under the floor, who had done the brave thing without knowing if it would work, whose words had outlasted the man who tried to silence them and were now part of the public record, permanent and indelible, the way important things should be. She folded the glove and put it in her own pocket. It would go on the shelf in the bedroom, eventually, where she'd put her grandmother's things, the particular shelf she'd built for things that mattered, things that carried someone in their weight. Clara's glove would go there, alongside the woman who had come after her, alongside the work they had each, in their different ways, done for the same family on the same land. The frontier teaches you what it teaches you, and what it taught Evelyn Mercer, what it took everything she had and a year of hard work and a tin box under the floor and a fence rail in the dark to teach her, was this. Strength doesn't live where people look for it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like what you expect. It looks like a thin girl walking into a stranger's kitchen with a cast iron skillet and making something out of nothing, and doing it again the next day, and the day after that. It looks like doing the work that needs doing, even when no one is watching, even when no one says thank you, even when you're not sure it will matter. It looks like staying, and sometimes, not always, not without cost, not without the particular marks that hard things leave. Sometimes staying is the most powerful thing a person can do.